after humans become completely dependent on AI and we either merge or become a zoo, where can we find meaning?
I don't really know how to answer that, because I don't think it's within the scope of anyone's vision to predict even what's likely to happen over the next 40 years, because the rate of technological advance is so insane that in some sense all bets are off. And I really mean that. I have a variety of contacts in Silicon Valley, and there are people there that I've been communicating with who believe that it's already within their power to build an AI machine that will have higher computational capacity than the human brain. That's within 5 years. Now that assumes that they've got the computational capacity of the brain properly calculated, and that's not necessarily the case. But even if they're out by a factor of 10, that's not many iterations past that. Now maybe we don't understand the brain at all. That's certainly possible. But it isn't just the rapid increase in computational power that's doubling so quickly. I don't know if how many of you watched the Boston Dynamics videos? Because it's the most advanced robotics company in the world, and it was a DARPA project, so an American defense company, and they were bought by Google 5 years ago, and they had pretty damn impressive robots 5 years ago. They were autonomous, and so they could make their way over rough terrain, including snow, up hills. If they slipped on the ice, they could right themselves. If you pushed them over, they could put themselves back up. And that's not joystick controlled. That was all autonomous. And they ran on gasoline-powered motors and were capable of autonomous action for an hour and a half or so. And I looked at the last iteration, and it's a small robot about this big, and it has a hand that looks like a head. And it's so sophisticated that it can gyrate to music spontaneously, and it can keep its head in the same place while it does it, like a chicken. And it can open doors, and it's quite the remarkable creature. And the rate of advance from the first robot, which was called Big Dog, which is a very terrifying thing to watch, Big Dog, to this is quite staggering, and that's only going to increase insanely, that ability over the next 5 years. And there's something very strange about robots that people don't generally think about. Some people do. Imagine you have a robot and it can learn a few things through imitation, and we already have robots that can do that, because you can program a robot, industrial robot that's worth about $20,000. You can move its arm the way you want it to move its arm, and then it will move its arm that way. So imitation is coming up very rapidly, and the capacity to autonomously learn is already there to some degree. And let's say you have a robot that can learn a little bit, not much. But then let's say you have 20 million of them, and they're all exactly the same, and they have exactly the same architecture. And so what that means, as soon as one robot learns something, then all 20 million of them learn it. And so if each robot is learning one thing a day, then the whole herd is learning 20 million things a day. And so once we hit a certain threshold, the rate of increase in robotic intelligence is going to be just something that we can't even comprehend. I talked to the people at Tesla who ran the autonomous car division, and they know perfectly well they weren't creating autonomous cars, because an autonomous car isn't a car. It's a robot. And it's not just a robot, it's a fleet of robots, and it's a fleet of intelligent robots, and some of the functions that it will perform will be the functions of a car. But to think about that as a car is just, you're just confused. It's like to think of a car as a horseless carriage. The person who ran the division told me that they'd already had plans instantiated so that all the Tesla cars map the roads, and they're mapping them at an increasingly high level of resolution, and then they share the data. And they expected to get to the point where the car would be able to predict where the bumps on the road were that it was approaching and adjust the suspension so that when you hit the bump you wouldn't feel that at all, because the suspension would have mapped the bump before it encountered it. And that's just, it seems like a trivial example in some sense, but it's not trivial. It's an example of how unbelievably quickly this technology is progressing. So now, what are we going to do about that? Well, I'm hoping that we're going to be smart enough as individuals, and careful enough, and ethical enough, and fast, so that as we continue to produce increasingly intelligent computers and robots that are going to mimic us, that they mimic something good enough so that it doesn't destroy us. And so a lot of that's going to depend on the ethical integrity of the people who are working on these advanced systems. And it's not like the people who are working on those systems, at least some of them don't understand that, because they do, and they also understand the tremendous danger that this poses. So what we're going to do when that all emerges that's anybody's guess, but hopefully we'll be wise enough to manage it with a certain degree of wisdom. We better. And that's another thing, I guess I can close the answer to that, is that, we're entering an era of exponential transformation. And I would say a lot of the evidence suggests that that's a good thing. So I would say on balance, the world is much better than it was 50 years ago. And why? Well, China is thriving. That wasn't true 50 years ago. India has a middle class that's larger than the middle class of the United States. The average person in the world is now middle class. We halved world poverty, absolute world poverty, between the year 2000 and the year 2012. It's the fastest rate of economic increase ever recorded by a large margin, right? The Northern Hemisphere is reforesting at quite a rapid rate. There's more trees now in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago, and more trees in China than there were 30 years ago. And people are being connected to the electrical power grid at an amazing rate. The child mortality rate in Africa is now what it was in Europe in 1952, which is an absolute bloody miracle. The fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. Like on the macroeconomic front, there's a tremendous number of incredibly positive things happening, and I think that it's within our capacity in the next 20 years to, well, even the UN predicts that at current rates of economic growth in developing countries, there won't be anybody in the world at the current level of privation by UN standards, which is $1.90 a day. There won't be anyone living at that level in the world by the year 2030, which is like, it's 12 years away. It's absolutely miraculous that that has occurred. And I think that there's a reasonable shot of eradicating the 5 major transmissible diseases. People like Bill Gates are working very hard on that with a certain degree of success. And so we could make hunger and a certain degree of pestilence a thing of the past, and maybe we could do the same thing with warfare if we're super careful. And so I think that we have the opportunity, if we could shake our post-war apocalyptic pessimism, we have the opportunity to make the world a far better place. But with all that technological power comes the capacity for things to go seriously sideways, so we better be wise enough to master our technology. And again, I would say, well, that's all on you. You're all going to be participating in this intensely, and it's all going to depend more than you think on the decisions that each of you make. So you better make the right decisions, because you've got a lot more power than you think, and it's going to increase at a tremendous rate.